Ladies and gentlemen, Excellency, I report of about more than 150 representatives and guests of honor from different neighboring friendly countries, ready and interesting to listen to your presentations. So please take a seat.
Mr. President, Madam Defense Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me as the Director Training of the Austrian Armed Forces and the Commandant of the Austrian National Defense Academy to welcome the President of the Czech Republic, Petr PAVEL, to our Academy today. Welcome, Mr. President. Mr. President, welcome, and thank you for your willingness not only to give a keynote address on our freedom and security in a globalized world, but also to answer questions. I'm also honored to welcome the Austrian Federal Minister of Defense, Claudia Tanner. Welcome, Minister. And because there are so many distinguished guests here within our state hall, I would end now and welcome to words of welcome on a general basis. I would say thank you for the persons represented or representing the other organizers of today's event. That is His Excellency Jerzy Schittler, the Czech ambassador to Vienna. Your Excellency, welcome. I would like to welcome also the former Federal Minister of Defense and the President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, Werner FASSLABEND. And last but not least, I would like to welcome the Ambassador Emil, BRIX, the Director of the Diplomatische Akademie Wien, the Vienna School of International Studies. Welcome. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you, to everybody who is attending today's keynote address here in person in our Sala Terrena or via streaming. The topic of President Pavel's keynote address could not be more topical. We live in very challenging times. The 24th of February 2022 forced even the most complacent Europeans to reassess realities and to take off rose-tinted spectacles. The German term Zeitenwende, a sea change, has been used. But the question remains whether the events of the past months were really unforeseeable or whether there had been indications which were either not seen or simply ignored. The globalized world we live in has offered many new opportunities, but has also produced new challenges. These challenges require that we stand together, that we defend and live up to our values. Close relationships built on trust are essential, especially or better, not only for small and medium-sized states. This is why events such as these evenings are so important. They illustrate the value of cooperation, of interaction, and of common goals. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, without further ado, I would now like to give the floor to the President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, Werner FASSLABEND, who will act as Master of Ceremonies. Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Minister FASSLABEND, the floor is yours.
Dear Mr. President, dear Mrs. Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it's a really great honor and a great pleasure that we can welcome today the President of the Czech Republic, General Petr PAVEL. And when I say this is not only the fact that he is stemming and coming from a military family, and he himself has a strong military career, an outstanding career, starting with just a normal way. And therefore, I also want to say maybe a few words to the person of the President. President Pavel was born in a small but very well-known town in the western part of the Czech Republic. Everybody in Austria would know Marienbad. And it's a great pleasure that you were very close, not only well to the Austrian world and also Austrian history, when I may say that, but also when you started your military career, one of the places where you went was not only the famous King's College in Great Britain, but of course just a normal military education at the Vysoká vojenská škola in Brno. And insofar, there certainly was quite some relationship. And afterwards, he had a career not only as the commander of special forces and in different functions, but he also became a war hero in the war in ex-Yugoslavia in Crimea, when he managed to bring out a really endangered unit, and he also became awarded for this achievement. And later on, of course, he continued nationally and internationally his career. He became the deputy and then also the general or the chief of the general staffs in the Czech Republic. And afterwards, he even became also the chair of NATO's military committee. And insofar, it certainly is an outstanding career. But today we will not only look at his military career, but we really also appreciate that he stood up and was ready to become a candidate for the presidency. Because, you know, from Austria, we were looking very intensely, of course, to the Czech development. And Václav Havel certainly set standards with an international level that was outstanding. And we have the strong feeling that you are the right man in this place. And insofar, we really want to welcome you, Mr. President. And we're looking forward to your words. Please take the floor.
Mr. Fassbender, thank you very much for your kind words. Let me tell you that wherever I am introduced to give a keynote speech, I have some hesitations because it suggests as if I have something of a key importance to say. So I would have to announce that it will not be probably so much a keynote speech, rather set of my remarks and observations to the topic, using my experience from my military service and also the privilege to serve in a number of countries, both in war times and peace times. If I am to address the title, Our Freedom and Security in a Globalized World, in which state it is, I would say it's shattered. We live in difficult times. When we look back 30 years and at the beginning of 90s, many, and I was among them, naively believed that the times of confrontation between the West and East are over, and that we are going to build a fully harmonical society and relationship between former enemies. We will start building prosperity in all our countries, and all of the tensions will be gone. In the Czechoslovakia at the time, we started getting ready for membership in the EU and NATO. We joined a program Partnership for Peace. We even discussed broadly in this time that even Russia could become a part of Partnership for Peace initiative. Then, by the end of the century, we came to getting members of the alliance in 1999. That was a great step ahead in our security and also prosperity, because not so many people consider membership in NATO as an entry ticket for investments to our economy. So it was also a great step for us to become later on members of the EU. So it all looked pretty well. Then we lived through an experience of 9/11, 2001, and declared a global war on terrorism. And suddenly the world changed. Article 5 of NATO was declared for the first time in the existence of the alliance. And even though it didn't have a direct military meaning, it was reflected in all of us getting to Afghanistan and fighting war against terrorism in Afghanistan and in a number of places around the world. Being so busy with fighting terrorism, we haven't noticed so much that Russia started dramatically changing. And in the first years of the new millennium, it still looked promising. NATO-Russia Council was established. We had a number of consultations with Russia. Russian delegation in NATO counted up to 53 people. There were regular meetings of NATO-Russia Council. But at the background, especially with the change in Russian leadership from President Yeltsin to President Putin, there were clear revanchist tendencies and Russian imperial tendencies in their foreign policy, which remained, unfortunately, mostly disregarded. And that led to a situation when President Putin in 2007 addressed the Munich Security Conference with a speech that could have been a cold shower if it was listened to carefully, but unfortunately it was not. Then we came to the Bucharest summit in 2008, where we invited that time Ukraine and Georgia to become new members of NATO without setting clear date. We raised a lot of expectations on their side. We created a lot of pressure on the side of Russia and some level of confusion among the allies, because not all of them were so excited that as President Bush, who was pushing for this announcement. And then we saw the military operation of Russia in Georgia in 2008. And then since that invasion to a sovereign country was left actually without any response, we saw a situation developing up to the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Could we have prevented that? It's easy to say yes, but since we were mostly driven by hopes, not by strategies, we were still looking at Russia as a partner with whom we can talk, and we were hoping that Russia was at the same situation as it was at the end of the millennium, when Russia left accession of several countries to NATO without any reaction. So we were expecting automatically that that would be the case again. And since then, Russia has changed. President Putin managed to convince the Russian population that the West is always setting the plots against Russia, that all the signs of friendship and straightforward approach were just, as Russians call it, maskirovka. And actually, the only thing that the West wants is to initiate colored revolutions, which Russia set as one of the greatest security challenges to Russia. Before that, we saw another interesting thing coming, and it was something that is called Gerasimov Doctrine. It's first not doctrine, it's not even a Gerasimov doctrine, but it's a way of thinking which was first introduced in 2010 in Russian military press and academia, and then it was articulated by Gerasimov in 2013. And it was actually first setting what we now call hybrid warfare, hybrid threats. Russian never called it that way. They called it non-linear warfare. And in fact, what did it mean? They went through the lessons made in a Cold War, and they realized that they cannot defeat the West by military means, by arming. They cannot defeat the West by economic tools. They cannot defeat it by the power of science. But they learned the lesson from the old masters like Sun Tzu. And one of the lessons says that if you cannot be as strong as your enemy, make it as weak as you or even weaker. So when they thought how to make West weaker than themselves, they focused on one of our greatest vulnerabilities, which is the openness of our system. So they focused on hitting us where we were the weakest, through the combination of tools coming from those being used by Russian intelligence services in the past, like psychological warfare, like special operations in the rear, like information operations, deception. But they combined it with new tools, especially information technologies and cyber operations. And they brought it all together as one big coordinated package, well centralized and well structured to focus on our weak points. And for us, at the very beginning, we thought that we simply don't have to do anything about it, because we believed that our societies were strong enough to withstand any such an attack, and that hybrid attacks actually are an invention of some of our analysts and not a reality. And it was good to observe from a Russian point of view that they were supporting this approach. And that's why a number of people in our countries still do not believe that there is something like hybrid warfare. Many of them even don't believe that disinformation campaigns are coordinated. Many of them even don't believe that cyber attacks are coordinated and structured from Russia. But they proved to be extremely effective. And before we learned how to at least partially react, they managed to divide us, they managed to insert confusion, they managed to insert distrust amongst our populations, distrust to the authorities, distrust to politicians, distrust to media. And what we see now is kind of confusion that is reflected inside our own societies, where we have difficulties to even agree on where and who our enemy is. So it is not just about Russia, but Russia was obviously at the beginning of it. But since the annexation of Crimea, we learned that Russia is not a partner, even though it remained a partner on paper, at least in NATO strategy concept for almost 10 next years. But we realized that we have to do something about it, and that's why this pressure brought us together and made us to agree on a number of sanctions, on reinforcement of eastern flank of NATO, on extending cooperation to a number of our partners and around the globe, and in fact to come up with a number of measures to reduce the power of Russian hybrid warfare. And then we got struck by the aggression against Ukraine, which again a number of us didn't believe it would happen. And it was because we simply assessed Russia through our own perspective, through our own assessments. Very few of us believed that President Putin will opt for the worst possible option for Russia, but he did, because he didn't see it that way. They saw it, and it was presented in that way to Russian population, that they didn't launch any war. They are acting in self-defense, as being pushed to the corner, as the last resort. And this is what we face now. Russian population in the vast majority doesn't accept the idea that they launched an aggressive war against sovereign nation. They do not accept that there is something like international law. They do not expect that. They do not respect that there is something like a UN Charter that they should also follow as signatories. So this is the situation where we have one big country with a huge nuclear arsenal openly disrespecting existing world order. And then we have at the background another such a big country, China, that is not perceived by many as a strategic challenge, but it is at least a strategic competitor or rival. And China is clearly in this setup on the side of Russia. What we can see is probably the beginning of a new era of strategic competition, this time not ideological West against ideological East, but rather democracies against different forms of authoritarian regime. We can broadly divide countries around the world into 4 groups. One, the world democracies who would like to preserve existing world order. Then at the opposite side, a group of autocratic nations who would like to change existing order. And in between there are 2 groups, one of them who are more or less happy with existing order and willing to cooperate with the democratic world. And then part of the countries that are more or less happy but willing to change if it is more profitable to them. And this is the era in which our world will definitely not be safer. It will be more complex. But it will also be more and more globalized because of a number of links that we have amongst ourselves. So in this extremely difficult environment, we have to think what we can do. Can we preserve the world order as it is? Or has the time come to accept that the world has become multipolar, and that potentially China has some right to adjust the world order to fit more to their needs and interests, because we have to accept that the world order as it exists today is tailored to democracies. So the only way how we can preserve the world to some extent as we know it now is to stay united, especially stay united amongst the world democracies, wherever they are, and then extend our hand to all the nations willing to cooperate and willing to preserve existing order, or if to adjust it, then to adjust it in a negotiation, not to let anyone to impose the changes that will be against our interest. So it is probably the beginning of era which we live in, and it will be very demanding. It will be extremely demanding for negotiations, for a willingness to listen and to understand. And that's why I think we have to be very open in our minds to listen to our partners from Asia Pacific, from Africa, from Latin America, because they have lots of their own views that don't have to be necessarily against our own, but are different in their perspective, and can be definitely right, and would deserve our consideration. We'll also have to be very careful about one more challenge beyond terrorism, which is definitely not dead, beyond all autocratic countries around the world, and it's our own internal enemy, and that's populism. I define it clearly as an enemy because we probably don't consider it that seriously, but it can very easily dissolve our countries from within. And it is as dangerous as any other threats from the outside, because if we allow the discussion, our internal political discussion, to be distorted by wishes and promises, if we let ourselves get away from the facts, if we stick to exaggerated political correctness, we will probably not be able to cope with the problems of our world as it is today. I will end up here and stay open to your questions. Thank you.
We will have a short panel discussion before we go into the audience. And we have the opportunity to share this table, this discussion. We share this discussion on the one hand with Ambassador BRIX, who has quite some experience as diplomat. He used to be Austria's ambassador in Moscow, but also in London. And at the other side, we also have a very experienced military man. He used to be the chief of staff for 2 ministers, and now more than 1 decade, he has been the commandant of the National Defense University, something that has quite some history. And okay, we will try to ask a few questions to you, Mr. President. And maybe let me start myself with a short question. You visited Ukraine just the other day together with Zuzana Čaputová from Slovakia in order not only to get a picture, but also to demonstrate solidarity. But you also made a few statements. One was that you said Ukraine doesn't have any longer the element of surprise it used to have in Kharkiv and in Kherson when it managed to overtake those 2 oblasts or regions. And you also gave sort of a little warning. You said, okay, Ukraine should not be pushed into a faster pace before they are fully prepared. And my first question, therefore, is, if you look at the situation now with your military eyes, and I would say, you know, you got those military eyes, maybe not from mother milk, but by father's milk. Okay, maybe how do you look at this strategic situation at the moment? And do you see a realistic chance for Ukraine to re-win, especially those 2 regions that were occupied by the Russians already in 2014, namely Donetsk and Luhansk on the one hand, and Crimea at the other side?
You said it will be a short and a simple question, but a very long and difficult answer. Well, first, I didn't exactly say that that the moment of surprise is impossible, but it will be more difficult to achieve because Russians, however, they are ineffective in their war fighting against Ukraine. they are not entirely stupid. So they learned their lesson from this first Ukrainian offensive, and they will probably not do the same mistake twice. They were building their defense lines continuously for at least 8 months. In hundreds of kilometers, they built 3 lines of defense with a number of obstacles, a number of minefields, a number of fire posts. It will be extremely difficult to go directly through this line without great casualties on Ukrainian side. I'm sure that Ukrainians are very much aware of it. So that's one moment. The other is about the pace. And I was trying to talk to Ukrainian leadership not to get pushed into hasty launch of the counteroffensive before they feel themselves to be fully ready. There might be some impatience on their side of supporting countries who would like to see some results. One reason is also to maintain public support for Ukraine, so that people in supporting countries don't expect this would go indefinitely. But at the same time, it will be Ukrainians who will be dying in this counteroffensive, and that's why it is necessary that the timing is theirs. Mm-hmm. And so that was my little piece of advice or encouragement to Ukrainians when I visited them. I also think that almost any development is possible. I mean, from let's say 2 opposites. One is that Russian military would collapse in Ukraine, and Ukrainians will be able to liberate all of the occupied territories, not just after the 24th of February 2022, but also those occupied in 2014. That's one side. The other is that their counteroffensive will be unsuccessful, and the situation will remain as it is right now, and it will be the basis for either preparing for another counteroffensive or start of negotiations. I believe that the real result will be somewhere in between. It is hard to imagine that the Russian military would completely collapse without resorting to using the tools that we wouldn't like to see, such as nuclear tactical weapons. It is also possible that Ukrainians will be able to liberate all of the territories occupied after last February, and at the same time they will realize themselves that it represents some basis for starting negotiation. But again, we shouldn't push them to such an understanding. It should be left entirely up to them where they start thinking about settlement, because it's them who are suffering thousands of casualties, it's them who are suffering tremendous material damage, it's them who suffered emotionally so much that even imagining that they should sit at the table with Russians is now beyond any discussion. So I think it is in our own interest not to let Russia prevail in this conflict. It is in our own interest to support Ukraine in bringing the situation to their own desired end state, and then assist them in rebuilding the country and rebuilding the system of European security again with peace negotiations, with new security arrangements, with potential new set of security guarantees, but it will all have to follow after the war fighting is over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. In your keynote, you mentioned 3 big challenges. The second was the rise of China. And you talked about it from the question of democracy versus an authoritarian system, a new rule of the world. On the other hand, of course, we are confronted with a complex situation that reaches from North Korea over Taiwan to the South China Sea. And you said already as president-elect, but before you overtook the office in the presidency, a strong signal calling the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. How do you see, or why did you do this signal? And how do you see the situation in the region? How do you see also the importance of the Taiwan question or the South China Sea question for European security and for politics?
Okay, let me first correct a little bit. I didn't call President of Taiwan. I was called by President of Taiwan. And since she's a woman, I took it as a matter of courtesy to accept the call. So I think it's a different story, but still a sign of goodwill towards Taiwan. Czech Republic has a lot of relations with Taiwan, especially economic. There's a lot of Taiwanese investments in Czech Republic, and we preserve the right to maintain these contacts wherever China thinks about it, without disregarding the policy adopted by our government, that is one China policy. It's our own. The whole China policy is now under the review. And we want to maintain relations with China at the basis of mutual advantage and mutual respect. But at the same time, we will not allow any interference into our own internal affairs, and one of them is our relationship to Taiwan. I'm ready to meet President of Taiwan at a convenient opportunity, not officially, not an official state visit to Taiwan or her visit to Czech Republic. But if there is a chance to meet her at the margins of some multilateral event, I don't see any problem of meeting her. With regard to China, in my view, will be our challenge for the future, much more than Russia, even though that some might think that China is some kind of a smiling, fluffy panda. It's not. China is a country that is desperately trying to present a nice face. But China is a country with a very strong autocratic rule based on fundamentally different principles than our own countries, with fundamentally different long-term objectives than ours, and with a clear intention to dominate the world in all the areas. And they are building all capacities to be dominant power, including military. Unlike Russians, who are or were boasting with every new piece of equipment, like Armata tank, when they produced first couple of them, they presented them on the Red Square and made the whole world believing that they rearmed all the land forces with this new piece of equipment. But they ended up with those 14 prototypes, and they were not even able to produce more of them to fight the war in Ukraine. China is not boasting with every new piece of equipment, they are doing it. So they are, for example, commissioning every year more combat vessels than all of the NATO together. They are building tremendous capabilities in space, in cyber. Only what we have from available sources, China has more people in their cyber force than are many of our militaries together. So, in fact, we have to take China seriously. We cannot let ourselves deceived by Chinese narrative of cooperation, of cultural exchange, of access to education, because it is all driven by long-term strategies that are clearly aimed at achieving Chinese goal. We were for a long time blind because we thought that China suffered a lot at the second half of the last century, and now it's time to let them breathe. So we actually opened the door to our best universities, and Chinese used this opportunity in full. Mm-hmm. Now we feel to be a little bit surprised by the speed of their progress, and we are just facing consequences of what we have allowed. We have to live with that. There is no need to portray China as a direct enemy. We don't have to push to isolate China. It's nonsense. It cannot be done. But we have to be aware of true Chinese intentions. We have to be aware that China is not a peaceful country. We have to be aware that China declared openly that they will integrate Taiwan through any means, including military. They are getting ready for it in a very open way. They are organizing exercises around Taiwan, clearly pointing to the direction of isolating Taiwan from any external support. And if we look back on Hong Kong, Taiwan is the next step. If we don't want Taiwan to end up the same way as Hong Kong, we should be aware that Taiwan needs our assistance. When it comes to South China Sea, it is our problem, even though it's so geographically distant, because through South China Sea, about half of the global trade of goods is coming to our shores as well. So if there is any military conflict in that area, we would feel it in Europe in a couple of days or latest the weeks. And it will be very difficult. We all remember what COVID did with some problems with global trade, and it was not the war, it was just COVID. Lots of the production of critical assets are now being produced in Asia Pacific. We transferred or allowed the transfer of this production to that area. We got dependent on that area, and now we have to find a way out of it. So these are all aspects that we have to be aware of when we deal with China.
Thank you. Because we want to use your capability fully, I ask now Ambassador BRIX, to ask a question or ask questions and make a statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. You talked about Russia and China and see them as the main rivals at the moment. I fully agree. I fully agree with your position on Russia from my experience there. Let me just mention one thing. I was on the Red Square on 9th of May on various occasions. And the Kremlin was always trying to make sure that there is clear skies, that they can send all their nice airplanes over that. But even Mr. Putin did not always succeed. There were some times when he could not do away with the clouds on the sky. So I think there is an uncertainty which we should also take into account and hopefully take into account. And I am a diplomat, Austria, neutral country. I would never have thought that I would ask you to send as soon as possible your Czech fighter planes to the Ukraine, which you somehow already mentioned. And so my question, I have two questions. The first question is actually, everything that you said concerns Europe, but you didn't talk about the European Union. You talked about NATO, you talked about the challenges, but not so much about the European Union. And if I have a concrete question, which has to do also with the military, but is European, it's the question of this shield, a missile shield. And my question is, are you more on the side of Mr. Macron, the fast and furious Frenchman, or are you more on the side of Mr. Scholz, the slow and, let's say hesitant one, but the one who wants to wait for the Europeans to be ready to produce enough material, and the other is saying actually it's urgent. We need to have this shield. I understand that Austria is more on the side of that we need them right now, and I'm almost sure that you would agree on that. But that would mean that Mr. Macron and the French, you have to be convinced of these sort of things. And this is typical for Europe. And many of the issues you raised have to do with this idea inside of the European Union, where you have different concepts of how to deal even with Russia or with China. In this context, as you know, Mr. Macron has to be mentioned as well. So how do you see this inner situation of the European Union? In examples and in general straight terms, what is your clear position how we can get our job together? Because you also spoke about democracies on the one side, but we have in the European Union countries where some people say they are not perfect democracies, and some of them are our neighboring countries, or one is a neighboring country at least, in this context. So how do you see, how can we defend these sort of issues in a quite uncertain situation of the European Union?
That would be for another long time debate. Okay, let me try to sum up and make it shorter. EU and NATO. I mentioned NATO mainly because NATO is structured and built to provide collective security. EU is not. EU never had an ambition to deliver collective security to its members. There are two main tasks on the list of European security and defense policy. And it's crisis management and cooperative security. That means cooperation with partners. And I believe it's the right division of labor. Because if EU has an ambition to provide collective defense, it will be clearly duplicating NATO with 2/3 of members of being in both organizations. It would mean that we would have to double all of the structures that NATO was building for now almost 80 years, including command and control structure, including strategic intelligence, logistics, communications, and a number of other assets that are existing in NATO, are well proven, people are well trained, established procedures. In fact, all this would have to be built in the EU separately. Countries don't have resources, primarily human resources, to man this parallel structure. And the only result would be that we would make, if we go that way, we would make EU not capable enough to provide for collective defense, and we would weaken NATO so that it wouldn't be able to provide for collective defense. It's exactly what Vladimir Putin would welcome. It would be exactly what we shouldn't do. So that's why I think when we talk about European defense, let's not talk about European army, as Emmanuel Macron used to say some time ago. But now he himself moved to the understanding that we can achieve better European defense through strengthening European pillar of NATO and extending cooperation to partners who are members of the EU, but not NATO. That's a quite promising way to go. And I believe it's also the idea that we should develop by growing up in Europe, because we cannot rely on the United States forever. The United States will not be here when they get committed in Asia Pacific. United States will be increasingly busier with China in a number of areas. And even though they most probably will remain in Europe, it will be not their main effort. So whatever bigger problem we will face, we will have to deal with it on our own. So it's a proper time to think about developing what in military terminology is called strategic enablers, because up to now, whatever bigger military operation was launched, it was always dependent on American capabilities. American strategic airlift, American strategic intelligence, American strategic logistics, because we don't have it in Europe. And that's the challenge that we have for the future. I think we should focus our attention that direction.
Okay. General CSITKOVITS.
Thank you. Mr. President, perhaps you will be surprised that the military is asking you the following question, but on the one hand, it's part of our portfolio, part of our tasks, our mission. On the other hand, you mentioned within your keynote speech the threats from Russia going to open societies, the hybrid warfare, and the distrust perhaps within open societies. And the third, a few seconds ago, you mentioned the necessities what we have to obey within the European Union. In former times, or during the Cold War, Austria recognized that national defense is not limited to the armed forces. Therefore, we had a comprehensive national defense, consisting not only of the pillar military defense, but of psychological, economic, civilian defense, and of course the fourth pillar, the military defense. Could you imagine, because from my point of view it's a necessity, the psychological effect that the society is able to defend itself, that the society knows where you have to strengthen your necessities. And this would lead up to stock building, diversification, resilience of the society and so on. Could you imagine that such a comprehensive approach to defense could be even implemented within the European Union?
It's a really good question. Let me start by saying that living for so long in peace in Europe, with the exception of war in former Yugoslavia, we got used so much to our own comfort that we cannot even imagine to sacrifice part of it for our own security. We all believe now, many of us, that the defense and security is a business of those in uniform, being it in a national service or in service of international organizations. The war in Ukraine showed us a lesson that whatever the progress we made in technologies, the war becomes or remains as brutal as it used to be in the past, and that in the war people are dying. In some areas even in large numbers. It doesn't avoid civilians. It doesn't avoid huge material damage. So if we want to be successful in defending ourselves, not just against military attacks, because current conflicts are being run on multiple levels and domains. In fact, both Russia and China do not distinguish, as we do in our theory, between the time of peace, crisis, and war. For them, it's one continuum. And, the history of the mankind is just one continuing conflict. And what is changing is the set of tools and the intensity of use of these tools. So, in fact, once we accept that we are confronted with a systemic rival like China and Russia, we can expect that we will be confronted at different levels. Economic level, information level, or rather disinformation level, cyber level, and many others. And on top of it, there is also a military level. If we want to be successful in defending ourselves against all these levels, it includes the whole society, it includes all areas, it includes resilience of individual citizens, and also the whole system of our countries. This is fundamental change. Not all of us understand that even after the beginning of war in Ukraine. There are still people who don't get it and will need to be convinced that this is the necessity. And we will also have to open a public debate that sacrifice is something that did not disappear from our life. And it's necessary if we want to preserve the freedoms and the benefits of living in democratic societies. And that sacrifice doesn't necessarily have to be sacrifice of life, as people in uniform promise to do. It's a sacrifice of potentially our own comfort or our contribution in kind for successful defense. And that is what we need. What we need to develop both nationally and within the EU and NATO. NATO is probably ahead of that because they understand successful defense in a very complex and comprehensive way. But there is still a lot of work to be done. Not necessarily militarizing our societies, but making everyone aware that the risks are not only dressed in uniform and equipped with firing weapons, but that the risks are hidden sometimes in a very nice suits and nice packages.
Yeah, thank you very much for answering the panel question. Yeah, and another question.
A short question on diplomacy, because, Mr. President, you mentioned it's too early in the Ukraine conflict really to be successful with negotiations, and you said the earliest time may be after the outcome of the next counteroffensive, or maybe even later, and then it may come in steps, the negotiations. So how do you see, when does the role of diplomacy really have a chance in this conflict? Is it decided on the battlefield, as we are all saying, including the diplomats? Or how do you see the possibilities of diplomacy in such a conflict? And who might be the people who can be helpful here? We know which countries are trying this. And I do understand from what you said about China, you don't think that China might be the best suited negotiator or mediator.
Yeah. That's very difficult to say. On one hand, there is obviously always room for diplomacy. So we shouldn't leave diplomacy aside waiting for some state of things. Any opportunity to look for options for peaceful solution is good. But at this point, clearly there is no basis for peace negotiation, because at this state of things, it's quite acceptable for Russia. That's why they say, let's accept status quo and we can start negotiating. It's totally unacceptable for Ukraine, and it should be unacceptable for us, because if we accept the status quo, we have compromised all our values with which we started supporting Ukraine from the very beginning. Usually the war or the wars do not end up with a total defeat of an enemy, like in the case of the Second World War and Nazi Germany. There was probably no other option. But the idea of totally defeating Russia is a nonsense. There is even no desire to totally defeat Russia, but defeat Russia in Ukraine. But of course, we cannot expect that Russia would accept to withdraw from all Ukrainian territories and not getting anything in return. So it will have to be pushed, forced, and the only way is to get a better position for negotiation through counteroffensive. And once Ukraine exhausts all options or powers to push forward, then it will be most probably at the time for them to realize that the time has come for the negotiation. But they will try to do it at the best possible situation on the ground. So that's why I think we really have to wait for the outcome of the counteroffensive, because believing that somehow out of the sky there will be someone coming with brilliant proposal and both sides will agree to it, and Russians will withdraw, Ukrainians will restore their territorial integrity, is simply idealistic. It will not happen. And which country is best suited? Obviously, the best would be someone who is respected by Russia. But who is now respected by Russia? Is it United States? Definitely not. Is it within the EU? There are no countries who would have sufficient weight and respect from Russia. So it could be either China, but China doesn't want to take that position. It could be India, but India will probably not take that position because India has some strong links to Russia and wants to stay away of the conflict. So it is difficult to judge who will be best suited to come up with that. I think probably the only way is to get the widest possible support from international community to exert sufficient pressure on Russia to start negotiation, and then use all the skills of diplomacy to come up with a solution that will be acceptable by both sides. But at this point, it's really hard to imagine what such a solution could be.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure there are so many questions within the audience. There is a small opportunity to ask a question, and I start over there. Please wait until you get a micro, and please tell us your name and ask a very short and comprehensive question.
Thank you. Retired Colonel Ernest, thank you very much. Sir, you mentioned China. A lot of people think there's a bigger threat by China than by Russia. Maybe not military-wise for Europe, but especially economically. China bought a whole harbor or an airfield in the middle of Europe. Even ecologically, when we see that China is building 8 to 10 coal-fired power stations every month, or the engagement of China in Africa or in South America or Middle America is enormous. What do you think can we do, or should Europe do, to prevent or at least minimize this threat by China?
Okay, thank you. Maybe we take 2 or 3 questions together. Yeah, I have another one over here. Colonel Fronek.
Thank you, President. I have a question concerning your keynote. You spoke about the weaknesses in our society and that it was used, let's say, to use a hybrid warfare by the Russians. You spoke also about how the population in Russia sees themselves. And we see that, as you said, we misunderstand them to a certain point because they think that they're in their rights. Do you think that the way to turn this whole thing around is to turn around the population's mindset in Russia again, like it was maybe 25 years ago? Would that be an option, or is this not an option anymore?
Thank you. And there was a third one in the middle. Yeah, you can see it.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Guy Binet. I'm a French former military and also a former OSCE staff. In other words, I am a has-been guy. Nevertheless, I have a question, President. Apparently, it looks to me that today you are in Vienna, while you might have been in Chisinau because of the summit of the EPC, the European Political Community. The summit that you held last year in Prague, when you opened this as a hosting state, this new structure. So my question is about what do you think about this structure, this new structure, and do you think that it is really added value regarding the field of security for the European community at large? Thank you very much.
Okay, I close the list of speakers now, and maybe at the end I ask also my last question. You mentioned President Macron. Yesterday he was the star guest at Globalized in Bratislava, and you are absolutely right. He pleaded for a European pillar within NATO. Make it clear. My question is, what do we need in order to shape a European pillar within NATO? And how fast can we achieve it without risking Europe's role in the future?
European commander.
Yeah.
Okay, let me start with China, economy and ecology. When it comes to Chinese economic power, I think the only thing we can do about it is to overcome our own friction points and go over differences among ourselves. Because if we compete between Europe and the United States, if we compete among ourselves within the EU, we are losing not only energy but also resources to compete with China. We were not able even to agree on one policy towards China in the EU so far. It's under say construction in the EU, but we are still not yet there to provide sufficient counterweight to China. We are still quite prone to accepting large investments from China to different spheres of our economies, including critical infrastructure. And obviously China is getting influence through these investments, getting control of a number of countries. We are leaving too much space in Africa and Central Asia and Latin America for China, because we are still not pragmatic enough to understand that whatever space we leave open, China will fill it in their own interest. And we usually come up with too many conditions to cooperate with countries with a different level of democratic deficit, while China doesn't take any care about it. They come up with loads of money They do not hesitate to corrupt local governments, get what they want, and stay there to have the influence. I'm not saying that we should corrupt leaders in many countries, but we should be definitely more pragmatic and probably not presenting too many conditions, but rather pragmatically cooperating and bringing these countries on our side. And making them willing to cooperate with us rather than with China. When it comes to ecology, I don't think that it is so bad with China, because when you look at the measures they are taking within China, they made a lot of investments into getting rid of pollution of the air, water. They are probably moving some parts of dirty industries into other countries. That's correct. But they are also quite active in all for leading to taking more measures to control the pollution and production of carbon dioxide. So I think there is at least the ecology is a good opportunity for us to cooperate with China. At least in this area, we have common interest, because polluted air and water doesn't stop at Chinese border. So they are aware that they have to be active in that area as well. Question on hybrid warfare in Russia and potential of change of mind in Russian population. I think many people were putting some hopes into young Russian generation. But when you look at the internal information coming from Russia, young Russians are convinced about the rightness of their approach in a similar way as a middle or senior generation. So there is actually no much prospect for hoping that once they get older, this generational change will mean that Russia will become a better country. It will take a lot of time for Russian society to change. They have no previous experience with democracy, and actually they have a very distorted picture of democracy. When in the 90s, there were two big initiatives. One of them was called democratization. In Russian, they called it dermokratizatsiya. Dermo is a Russian word for an excrement. So, in fact, in Russian understanding, democracy is something rotten. And they are deliberately picking up from our open sources pieces of information that we criticize ourselves, and they make it a substance of Western democracy. So if you say in Russia that Western liberal democracies, it equals evil, nothing less. Russians generally admire the benefits of living in democracy, but at the same time they are so afraid of getting democracy at home that it will be extremely difficult to convince them that living in democracy is actually a good thing. Many of them don't want to be responsible for themselves. They are used to be led, especially being led by a strong leader, because it's quite convenient. First, you don't have to think. Someone will do it for you. And if you complain about your life, you cannot blame yourself. You can always blame the leader, because he is incapable. So they admire the power, they admire the force, but they don't admire someone who would be liberal, because liberal is almost the same word as loser. And Russians don't understand win-win situations. They either win or lose. They have the saying in Russian, "Я генерал, ты дурак. Ты генерал, я дурак," which translated in English means that if I am general, then you have to be stupid, and vice versa. We cannot be both smart. It's not possible. So it is critically important that we have a good understanding of Russian way of thinking, but the same comes for China. So we need people educated in sinology. We need people educated in Russian studies. We need to understand how they assess what is going on around them. Because if we judge them based on our own algorithms of thinking, we will usually come to wrong conclusions. Then a question on EPC, why I'm not there and here. First, we have a division of labor within our top 4 institutional leaders, and Prime Minister is there because we agreed that wherever we have the issues dealing more with the EU broad spectrum of affairs, it will be an issue for Prime Minister as a top executive power. And when it comes to NATO, UN, and some other areas, it will be my responsibility. When I look at the EPC and its usefulness or not, it is a consultation forum. It was constructed in a way that it shouldn't be binding, it shouldn't be based on a firm agenda, it shouldn't be based on producing any specific outcomes or to-do lists. It was envisaged to be a discussion forum, allowing open debate. This is what we agreed on again with President Macron and other leaders in Reykjavik when we discussed the topics or possible topics for this meeting, and it was agreed by all that this is the way how they want to preserve it. So I think we shouldn't expect from it anything more. It shouldn't be institutionalized into another EU minus or anything else. It should be an open forum. And then another question on Emmanuel Macron and GlobeSec and European pillar of NATO. First, I have to say I am grateful that President Macron changed the arguments from European army to European pillar, because it's more tangible. European pillar of NATO is well structured. We have in Europe most of the military installations necessary for collective defense. If we want to institutionalize it more, we have to come to an agreement, especially with our North American allies, that there might be a scenario where they will not be willing to participate. They will not object any activity, but they will not be participating, or at least one of them. And at the same time, that they wouldn't prevent use of these common facilities for the purpose of European defensive action. And in that case, all these facilities can be used in defense of Europe the same way as it was under the arrangement of Berlin Plus, where European Strategic Command, specifically a deputy commander, because Supreme Commander for Europe is by definition American 4-star, but deputy is either British or French. In that case, Supreme Commander of Europe or European pillar could be a European commander and would be using all the existing capabilities and on top of it, some capabilities of non-NATO EU members.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. President, thank you so much, not only for the clear picture you gave us, but also for the far-reaching global perspective you gave us. And I think at least we owe you a very big hand for coming and for your clear words, for your analysis, for your keynote speech, and also for being ready to discuss with the audience. Thank you so much. There is only one wish we can utter. We wish you a long and successful presidency. And be sure we back you. Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Maybe for a picture.